Okay, here we are. We're going to talk about psilocybin. We know, based on evidence, that psychedelic mushrooms have been used by humans since before recorded history, and throughout human history. In the 1950s, there was some scientific research and some development that was started by some noted folks, Hoffman among them. As we know, in the 1970s, the war on drugs, the war on intellectual freedom, on freedom in general, was started with the Controlled Substances Act. And it pretty much thwarted all meaningful research on psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, and really any advances were stopped at that time. Fortunately, today, we are seeing a revitalization of interest and research in the use of psilocybin, and that's what we're going to focus on today because of the time that we have and the panel that we've assembled for you. There are a couple things that have led to that. The FDA has approved psilocybin again as a breakthrough therapy. So it has allowed research studies at Johns Hopkins, UCLA, and NYU that are studying the therapeutic impacts of psilocybin on depression, anxiety, end of life, and addiction treatments. Coupled with that, we now have a policy reform movement that is underway. Denver in May legalized or decriminalized psilocybin. Yeah, really cool. Really amazing. I don't know why Denver's always ahead of us. Maybe it's because they're a mile high, so they just are closer. I don't know. But good for them. And we now have other decriminalization measures that will be on your ballots, coming to a ballot near you. One in Oakland and several other cities, and then Decriminalize California, which we'll hear a little bit more about because a couple of our folks here are heavily involved in that campaign. So today we wanted to have a high-level discussion about psilocybin. Hopefully you will learn something. You may know a lot about it already, but hopefully you will learn something, or you will take away something that just makes you more curious about the plant, about the policy reform, about the research, about the mycology, some sort of strain of knowledge or curiosity that you take away from this. So that's the point for today. Of course, we have an hour, so we can only kind of scratch the surface. We've spent a whole day talking about cannabis and could probably do it for several more. Same is absolutely true of psilocybin. So to help me whet your curiosity, I have these three lovely people here to my left, and I'd like to introduce them. So, to my left is Madison Margolin. Madison is an LA and New York-based journalist on the cannabis and psychedelics beat. She has been published in Rolling Stone, Playboy, lots of amazing publications, and she has started Double Blind, which is a journal. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, good. I'm so glad to know that so many of you are familiar with it. I was blown away by it when I read it. It's beautifully, beautifully done. Her partner, Shelby Hartman, is up here in the front. These two amazing young women have started what is really a groundbreaking journal. So if you haven't seen it out in the hallway, go pick it up and take a look at that. So Madison is here to help us along this conversation. And next to Madison is Will Goss. Will is a trained, he was educated in plant genetics and mycology. He is a mycologist, a forager, a researcher, and he is currently the Mycology Director for Decriminalize California, which is the ballot initiative that will be, God willing, coming to you should they gather enough signatures. And I'm sure they need volunteers. Yeah. And then on the end is Dr. Michele Ross. Dr. Ross is a neuroscientist, a therapist, just an advocate and a researcher, both for psilocybin and for other psychedelic and plant-based therapies. She is the research director for Decriminalize California and the founder of Infused Health, which is an online platform that helps people heal through magical plants and compounds. So thank you so much for letting me introduce them to you. Okay, so when we hear about research around psilocybin in particular being helpful for folks healing from depression, anxiety, dealing with end of life, major illnesses, what is it that's happening in the brain that makes that the case?
Okay, so we spent the whole day talking about cannabis research, cannabis manufacturing, cultivation, etc. We're going to switch gears a little bit here with psilocybin. Now, just like THC, psilocybin is psychoactive. So it actually changes our perception of things. It can rewire our brain. There's so many interesting things about it that makes sense that we're talking about it in the same place as we're talking about cannabis. But it all comes down to the default mode network. And so the default mode network is really our state of consciousness, our state of being. It really controls what we think about ourselves, what we think about others, how we think about our past, how we think about our future. It really is us. What's interesting about the default mode network is that basically it's not active when we're consumed with thinking about tasks or doing things, or we're in a flow state, we're like really enjoying ourselves, we sort of have turned our ego off and we're in the present moment. But when we're not really active, when we're just sitting around, when we're daydreaming, when we're thinking about our jobs or whatever that is, that's when the default mode network is on. And for certain different brain diseases, there's actually either too much activity of this default mode network or there's too little activity. Now, really, what is this default mode network? It's a bunch of brain regions that are interconnected, that are communicating. So different parts of your cortex, that front part of your brain that does all the thinking. If there's too much activity there, like you have in depression, you can actually have too much activity there. And so when you think about, okay, I'm thinking that I'm worthless, or I'm thinking too much about bad things that happen, you're just overthinking and ruminating, that's too much activity in those brain regions, and that's pathological. Anxiety, you can also have similar things. You can also have different brain conditions when there's not enough activity. For example, autism. There's actual evidence that shows that in autism you have too little functioning of the default mode network, and that maybe underlines why there are issues with connecting with other people and also understanding emotions in yourself. So this default mode network is super important. So too little activity, too much activity is not good. You want balance. You want that right amount so that we understand ourselves and our relationship in the world and to our past behaviors and future behaviors so that we can think and feel comfortable with ourselves. Now, why are we talking about psychedelics in this default mode network? Well, we actually know some things turn on and turn off this default mode network. Now, we know that cannabis, THC, can actually turn off the default mode network. We know LSD can. We also know psilocybin, that active molecule that's in magic mushrooms, can turn off the default mode network. And so if you're trying to help treat depression or anxiety, what you're looking for is to be able to shut off that hyperactive network and maybe switch off those negative thoughts about yourself, or stop thinking about those traumatic experiences. And psilocybin is actually a tool that has been proven in clinical trials to turn off this network and provide healing. So if you do a brain scan, you can see these different areas and say, okay, there's less activity there. And you might be able to correlate it with people feeling better. So when we talk about psilocybin mushrooms being so effective for mental health, there really is nothing out there like it that can really change these negative patterns, these negative brain patterns, and help people heal.
Excellent, thank you. Could you say a little bit, Dr. Ross, about serotonin and microdosing, and why is it that psilocybin as a compound mimics serotonin?
Sure. So it's really interesting that actually psilocybin is actually broken down into a compound called psilocin, and it's and it's actually very similar to serotonin. And so we have this natural fungi-based compound that fits in with our serotonin receptors. It actually activates a subtype called serotonin. It's a 2A subtype, and it's responsible. Almost all psychedelics stimulate the same receptor. And so the serotonin system, it's not the same as the endocannabinoid system. So we're not talking about cannabinoid receptors, CB1, CB2. We're talking about these serotonin receptors. Now, serotonin regulates everything from how much we eat, how much we have sex, how we sleep, how we wake, how we think and feel. The serotonin system is what's responsible, we think, for antidepressants working. So it's really an important function of our body. So if psilocybin containing mushrooms contain these compounds that can stimulate the serotonin system, again, that's why it's so important for mental health. Now, I actually did a lot of research on both mushrooms and on a process called neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is the birth of new brain cells in your brain. It doesn't just happen when you are a child, a baby. It actually occurs throughout life in an area called the hippocampus, which is your learning and memory center. So we know that certain compounds can actually boost this neurogenesis or brain cell development, and it can actually help rewire your brain for healing, for healthy thought processes, and sort of help, again, boost some of those pathways that are more positive rather than those negative pathways that lead to depression, that lead to trauma, reliving trauma and things like that. So we know that psilocybin, like all the other serotonin drugs, actually stimulates neurogenesis. So again, if we're looking at these compounds, it's very similar to any substance, any psychedelic that is stimulating your serotonin system is going to boost brain cell growth. It's going to rewire some of our synaptic branches, and again, heal our brain. So it's a fantastic tool to really reset our brain and set us up for healing.
Thank you. Yeah, totally. So I want to segue from that to talking about, the science of the brain to more the experience a bit. And so I want to ask Madison to talk about what she has learned about some scientific research around the concept of mysticism, having a mystical experience. Scientists are now starting to actually quantify that. There are, I think, 7 factors. And I want Madison to talk about her research around that. And she's interviewed some of the researchers who have an ongoing study at Johns Hopkins, right? Yeah. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
So the way, we're at a cannabis conference mainly, and you would think from cannabis policy there's only 2 ways to consume a plant. There's adult use or recreational and medical, and I think that leaves out the concept of mysticism and spirituality as something that is also a benefit to the consumer. So just to lay it out, there is something called the quote-unquote mystical experience that science has defined, and it's been found that the stronger your mystical experience, so the more criteria that you kind of check off during your psychedelic trip or clinical session, there's a correlation between that and the extent to which you're healing from addiction, depression, end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients, and so on. So to begin, it's not like scientists just discovered that psychedelics can be mystical, right? For thousands of years before this, humanity has had a sacred relationship with psilocybin mushrooms. And really, scientists began to pick up on that around the 50s and 60s. So in 1962, there was something called the Good Friday experiment that Walter Pahnke did under the supervision of Timothy Leary and the Harvard psilocybin project, and 9 out of 10, so they recruited about 20 divinity students from Boston University, and 9 out of 10 reported that they had experienced spiritual highs with psilocybin. So that was in 1962. Then currently at Johns Hopkins, Roland Griffiths, who's the head researcher there, is recruiting religious leaders from all different faiths, rabbis, imams, priests, Buddhist rohis, etc., to do psilocybin. And basically, the reason that religious leaders are so important to this is that these are people who are quote unquote already familiar with the idea of a mystical experience and are familiar having that conversation and using that rhetoric. So the actual tenets of the mystical experience are internal unity. So basically this pure awareness within yourself. External unity, which is kind of feeling connected in oneness with all other things. Transcendence of time and space. And ineffability or paradoxicality, meaning that it's hard to put the experience into words, or that you would need to kind of use contradictory descriptions to really to say what that felt like. A sense of sacredness and an intuitive knowledge of ultimate reality. So just sort of, if you've ever done psilocybin, you maybe have come to a feeling of, okay, everything is okay, and this is how it is, and everything is right with the world. A noetic quality, which speaks to that also sort of feeling of ultimate reality. And then 7 is a deeply felt positive mood. And if you have, basically, you're having a quote-unquote mystical experience if about 60 to 70% of this criteria are experienced by the user. And so basically, the main thing here is that I see psychedelics as sort of the intersection of science, the law, and spirituality or God. So a lot of the mechanism of action that people are, not the mechanism of action, but the way that people are experiencing psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is forcing scientists now to grapple with the concept of mystical experience. And that's going into the published research, and ultimately seeing now that we're going through these FDA-approved studies. I think psilocybin studies are in phase 2, if I'm not mistaken, and there are 3 phases. The concept of a patient having a mystical experience with God, or whatever you want to call it, is going to pave the way for psilocybin to become a legal psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy tool. And I think that's just fascinating. So,
thank you, Madison. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so speaking of God, let's talk about nature. Will, what is the life cycle of a mushroom? How do we get mushrooms from nature?
Excellent question. So first of all, we have to understand that mushrooms are in a different kingdom than plants, and they're actually more closely related to humans. They are heterotrophs. We are heterotrophs. We get our nutrition from out there in the environment and not sunlight. And so you can try to imagine a tiny spore, anywhere from like 4 to 20 microns in length, and that spore germinates or opens up, and just like the radical or first root of a seed, you have the initial growth from the spore, and that's called hyphae. Once you see a visible mass of hyphae, that's what you call mycelium. And hyphae is where all the action occurs in terms of the metabolism until the fungus is turned on and ready to undergo its sexual reproductive cycle. Some fungi produce mushrooms, not all of them do that. So you start with a spore. Some plants have spores, like ferns, these like prehistoric, really old evolved plants, have similar modes of growth and life cycles. But for the mushrooms that we're talking about, they're spreading by spores and growing into their environment through extracellular digestion. They're releasing enzymes into the environment, as well as metabolites, acids, bases. Basically, they're trying to create a suitable environment for their growth. Sometimes they are parasitic in nature. Sometimes they are symbiotic in the form of helping out plant roots. So we're here at a cannabis conference. Maybe some of you are growers, and you've used fertilizers and compost that have been inoculated with mycorrhizae fungi that are supposed to help those plant roots do a slightly better job of mining the soil for nutrients. And so Fungi grow in all sorts of different substrates or foods. They can grow in wood, makes them very special that they can break down lignin. A lot of the psilocybin mushroom containing mushrooms, of which there are over 200 species. A lot of them are associated with dung and growing out of cow patties, for instance. You've probably heard that. People go picking in ranchers' lands and maybe get scared off with a shotgun or something. But people think that the psilocybin and psilocin and these psychoactive components are actually an evolutionary trait by the mushroom to ward off insects. Insects are very common in, as a pest in the mushroom growing industry. Like fungal gnats are a real big problem, different types of flies. And so there have been studies that have shown that insects that have been fed psychedelic mushrooms, essentially, or maybe synthetic psilocybin, actually have a reduced appetite. And so those psychoactive components are a pest-deterrent, or like an anti-herbivory compound. And then I'll just add that this trait or this gene complex that's responsible for producing these psychoactive components, like psilocybin, psilocin. They've shown up in all these unrelated mushroom species. I mentioned 200, but these mushrooms are not actually very closely related. And so there was a paper released a couple years ago that gets into perhaps the origin of the extreme number of times that this has popped up in uncommon mushrooms. So the idea is posited that perhaps bacteria are doing horizontal gene transfer. Fungi have also been shown to be able to move these genes. So when the hyphae connect through a process called plasmogamy and karyogamy, they're sharing genetic material. And so you find that this trait has been transferred over to many different mushrooms because it's evolutionarily advantageous to improve their fitness. And I find that simply remarkable that hereditary, the genes that are passed down from one generation to generation are not the only means to which these properties are passed on or transferred in the environment. And Dr. Ross and I were talking about epigenetics, more on the human side of it. Maybe we could get a little bit into that later, and how some of these medicinal properties have such a long-lasting effect for people. And I just wanted to add, Madison, I think, didn't they talk to those patients like 20 years ago or something?
Rick Doblin did a follow-up.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so Rick Doblin followed up with, oh, sorry about that. Okay, right, sorry. So basically, Rick Doblin followed up with some of the people who were in the Good Friday experiment, and he did find some sort of methodological holes in the experiment. The double-blind nature of it wasn't as foolproof as double-blind studies are supposed to be. And just to explain what double-blind is neither the subject nor the researcher knows what they're taking. So in that experiment, this placebo was an active placebo. There was still a little bit of an effect, so it wouldn't be totally obvious because they were all sort of in the same environment. But he had found some holes in it. But the bottom line is that, and Doblin wrote this, is that the drug-induced mysticism is not inferior to other types of mysticism. So the idea being that you can have a very legitimate mystical, spiritual, religious experience from psilocybin. And again, now researchers at Johns Hopkins and NYU have been going on to kind of pick up where the Good Friday experiment left and Doblin's follow-up, which was in 1987, left off. And that's an ongoing study now. But Yeah, and another researcher, Charles Grobe, who's at UCLA, has talked about the concept of applied mysticism. And I think what mushrooms are forcing scientists to do is to look at the shamanic history and sacred and spiritual uses of psilocybin long before science really, or Western scientists at our universities here, quote unquote, discovered them. And it's realizing that, and we write about this in Double Blind, is the difference between a synthetic psilocybin experience and actually taking the real mushrooms, which come with other, probably you can explain what else is in the real mushrooms versus the synthetic isolate of psilocybin. But there's a lot that's lost in synthesis and in the experience of sitting in a room with blindfolds and two therapists, a man and a woman, for 6 hours or however long your experience is, versus doing it in a ceremonial environment with a medicine person or a shaman or whatever you want to call it, with songs and with basically the cultural technology that humanity has used for centuries that goes along with psilocybin.
And I wanted to jump in there and talk about why it's so important to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms, right? We've heard about the MAP studies, right? Eventually, after the clinical trial process goes through, they've shown efficacy for using psilocybin to treat anxiety, addiction, all sorts of different things, that it will be approved as a pharmaceutical drug that a doctor will have to prescribe. Well, if we look at the history of cannabis, for example, THC was approved in 1985 as Marinol. CBD was just approved as a pharmaceutical drug as Epidiolex for epilepsy. Now, is cannabis legal? Nope, it's still illegal federally. So legalizing just an isolated chemical or active ingredient in these plant-based substances did not actually change the legality of the whole plant. Am I on? Okay. It's really important for us to look at decriminalizing the mushroom itself, because again, we want people to be able to access a mushroom. We want to be able to access something that you can grow safely at home and consume, and there are benefits to using these substances at home. And also there's benefits to using magic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms at different dosages. So we talked a little bit about mystical experiences. Now that's sort of a macro dose, so a very large dose that's intended to have hallucinogenic properties. You can also use psilocybin mushrooms at microdoses. So these are doses a little bit under half a gram that might not really produce any type of hallucination or any psychoactivity. You just might feel maybe a little bit more focused, a little bit more clear, a little bit more creative. For somebody who's in pain with fibromyalgia, for example, like myself, you might microdose to actually distract you a little bit from the pain. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons why somebody would microdose, and you're not going to get that mystical experience, but you're still going to get benefits. And there's even clinical research suggesting and proving some of those benefits, that it's not just placebo, that you can take small amounts of psilocybin mushrooms and actually benefit from it. You can also take those macrodoses, and there's other purposes and setting that is going to actually help you get those benefits out of mushrooms. So very much like THC, where you can do microdosing, where you're not high, but you're still getting anxiety relief or a little bit of pain relief, or you can take those big doses and feel great, or even have a mystical experience. It's very similar, and I just wanted to touch on that there's many different ways to use psilocybin mushrooms, and it's going to be different than just taking, say, a psilocybin pill.
Great. Thank you, Michele. That actually segues to a question I wanted to ask you all about leading to legalization. But if there was something else you wanted to add, Will, before we do that, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I wanted to bring up, I went to an interesting talk about ketamine pharmacology. And doctors are so afraid of this mystical experience that they're actually prescribing alongside these legal ketamine treatments a drug that will deactivate or prevent the mystical experience. And to me, you're kind of robbing people of this healing experience. And I'm a big proponent of the kind of whole plant or whole mushroom medicine, and that it's important sometimes to go through some of that like anxiety or like nausea associated that you might be have associated with trips on mushrooms, because that's your body telling you to get rid of something, and I think that's equally as important as the euphoria and the kind of the feel-good parts of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, so before I do that, actually, I'll ask this question because it piggybacks off what you all were just speaking about. So, we heard about the entourage effect in cannabis today, quite a bit. Is there? Well, I guess, do we have any research about whether whole mushroom versus a synthetic psilocybin, whether there's a difference, and are there other compounds besides psilocybin that are active in the psychedelic component of a mushroom?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a really good question, because this is a good kind of parallel between cannabis. Although I would say, in my limited understanding, that it's much more complex with cannabis. But yeah. So we talk about psilocybin. It breaks down dephosphorylates into psilocin, and then there's a breakdown of that into basistin, and then there's a breakdown of that into norbasistin, and I think there's many more compounds that we're still very novice and still haven't really researched, and that's part of why we want to decriminalize mushrooms, so we can actually fully carry out this research. But most of the time, folks are looking at the ratio between psilocybin and psilocin, and most of the times people are cultivating or talking about cubensis, which are one of the lesser active mushrooms. It's third out of these 200, but I think we've still got a lot to learn. Also, the mycelium of these fungi can also have active components, meaning that the mycelium and not just the mushroom have psilocybin and psilocin, and it has a different structure in its it's a different morphology. So you could reason to think that it has a different metabolism in your body as well.
Great, thank you.
How exciting is that, by the way?
Yeah, right?
I just want to stress how many strains of cannabis there are. Thinking about all the different cultivars, over 200 mushrooms that contain psilocybin. We may find out that some are great for PTSD, for example. Some are great for pain. We are just scratching the surface on what we know and what we could learn.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, psilocybin is a Schedule I drug. So just same as cannabis, no accepted use by the federal government. So still Schedule I. And in California, we are one of a handful of states that actually make it a crime to possess the spores of a psychedelic mushroom.
Idaho and Georgia being the other two.
There we go. We're
Let's
in great company there.
No offense.
So that leads to my next question. Okay, so I came to learn when I was getting ready for this talk that there is a bit of a debate among learned people in this area about whether policy reform should give way to scientific research, and we should wait. I think there's definitely some holdover from Timothy Leary in the 70s. There's definitely there was a feeling in the scientific community that really set things back in a major way. Whether you believe that or not, or whether that's factually accurate, it is the case that folks do kind of have this. There's a little bit of a debate about whether we should not legalize, should not decriminalize, so that we can let scientists do their work, and then we'll come to it later once we have more information. As opposed to folks who say, no, we need to decriminalize because one, it's just about fundamental freedom. But second, that really it supports the kind of research that we actually need to do, and maybe that leads to the idea of whole mushroom as opposed to just a synthetic or an isolate of a certain compound. And how it might also, how legalization might relate to the actual experience that folks would have when they are on it. So whoever wants to take it first. What say you about legalization versus policy reform? Yeah, you got it.
As a scientist, it's sort of funny. I never really thought I would get involved in drug policy reform. We're supposed to get, not play in politics, especially when the government is the one funding or not funding your research, right? It took me actually leaving academia and actually founding my own nonprofit and working with groups like Drug Policy Alliance to actually have the voice to make change. And so when we talk about scientists shouldn't be getting involved in drug reform, well, the fact that these substances are federally illegal actually does hamper research. For example, if you have patients that with anxiety, depression, for example, that might benefit from consuming psilocybin mushrooms, but are scared of getting them because they're illegal, right? They're scared of losing their children, losing their job, getting drug tested, whatever it is. They're not going to participate even in an observational study, right? Even if it's just an app that's saying, hey, tell us what kind of mushroom you took, how much you did it, what you did, how it felt like, maybe record your trip. Not everyone is going to be open to doing that. And so it's really hard for us to collect data when it is still a Schedule I drug and there are state and federal penalties associated with it. We saw this in states where cannabis was illegal. You know, if you were fearful about going to jail if you reported your use, you weren't going to fill out that app, you weren't going to participate in that research study, you were really scared. And I think that legalization will help improve our ability to do some of the research. Again, we're going to have to go in baby steps, right? California first, states first, and then hopefully federal level will change at some point, but it will help destigmatize the use and also destigmatize the research around it. And I think that research is a really big part of Decriminalize California. We want to learn how it's helping people. We want to learn if it's safe or not safe for certain groups. What the research shows us right now is that it's pretty safe. We want to be able to practice harm reduction rather than saying, wait, we need more research. There's already over 30 clinical trials on clinicaltrial.gov on psilocybin. You can see all the different studies out there. It's been researched. It can be researched more, but we cannot accept things like, you know, our government saying there's not enough research on cannabis. That's why it's still Schedule I. You know, how many more studies do we need? It's sort of this limiting fear-based approach to, you know, drug reform policy rather than saying, hey, you know, we have veterans dying, we have people dying from depression, right, through suicide. 25% of people with depression are treatment resistant. That means no pharmaceutical or other treatment is going to dent their depression. Are we going to wait for them to commit suicide, or are we going to allow them compassionate access to a fungus that grows from the ground that could be beneficial for their depression? You know, as a scientist in me, I hope, and there's other scientists here, that you feel compelled to go with your heart to change laws, to participate in this research, and again, moral obligation to change really bad drug laws in this state and in this country.
I thought you might say that. Okay, Will, you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, that was amazing. Fully, agree with everything you're saying. I actually started off as a poli-sci major in college. I'm so glad I didn't, but I'm also so glad I am sitting up here with these professionals talking about drug reform. One thing that I just want to vibe off of from this conference, thinking about the talk about the Mississippi dirt weed. What I think of, and there's this controversy right now happening with this organization called Compass, and there's this real fear that they are creating this monopoly on synthetic psilocybin. And so by keeping it illegal, you're able to consolidate that power and money into a small group of people when we're talking about something that has been used traditionally throughout the world. I would add, this is a global, a phenomenon in tradition for thousands of years. And at the end of the day, for all the therapeutic, medicinal, and spiritual benefits and advantages, I'm of the mind, I think, as with many people in this room, that it's a problem with the government telling us what we can and can't do with our bodies, and I have a big problem with that, and think that should change immediately.
Right on. Thanks, Will.
So, as a journalist, I'm not really supposed to take an official opinion on this. As a human being, I don't think anyone should be in jail for a plant or a fungus, and so automatically I believe in decriminalization. And to your point, I mean, one thing is that the FDA-approved trials, that's going to pharmaceuticalize these substances in a synthetic format, which would mean legally then taking a whole mushroom doesn't mean the same thing as taking a synthetic pill or capsule of psilocybin, and that's just false. So one thing that I'm worried about, and I wrote about this also in Double Blind, is what can the up-and-coming psychedelic industry learn from cannabis? One thing is Compass, again, does pose a serious concern about a monopoly on pharmaceuticalized psilocybin. And also, whether it's Compass or some other company, the idea, I mean, there are still going to be questions of accessibility, access, affordability, whether this will be covered by insurance and stuff like that, which will make it so that most people, not most people, but a certain class of people are able to access psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and everyone else is still going to have to risk their legal freedoms to get the same benefits, or not even the same benefits. One thing I also want to note is that there's a lot of enthusiasm around this, and a lot of the benefits that people are getting from psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is happening specifically in that context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, not necessarily like out with your friends or at a party or whatever. Sometimes you are going to have an amazing transformative experience in an unregulated or unclinical setting, but the results that we're seeing are only specifically in those clinical settings. So in order to, whether or not the majority of these psychedelics, whether it's MDMA or psilocybin and so forth, are available through the pharmaceuticalized model or through decriminalization. I think that's something that right now psychedelic industry people and advocates and activists and scientists are going to have to ask themselves as we go forward and vote for Decriminalize California and everything else.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So we have just a few minutes left, so I want to do a little bit of a lightning round. I have a couple questions I want to ask each of the folks up here. Madison, we'll start with you since we've started down at the other end. So can you share what a book or a study or an article or a song or a poem or a finding or something that you would like to share that will spark curiosity?
Yeah, so one thing is that when we talk about psychedelics, we talk about the wellness of the individual and the wellness of the collective and the good, or the good of kind of everybody at large. And so I think that psychedelics have the power not just to transform a person, but then to transform the way they vote or the way that they are a political citizen in wherever they are and wherever they're living. So there's one study that Natalie Ginsburg from MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, is doing, which is looking at ayahuasca in conflict resolution between Israelis and Palestinians. Yeah. So I think that whether or not everyone in a conflict zone is going to have access to psychedelics, but I think as we start to apply psychedelic principles and ethos to the way that we approach policies and politics and the way we vote, that's really going to transform the current paradigm.
Thank you. Will?
Yeah, I'm inspired by the work of Paul Stamets. He wrote, a couple of fans in the audience, very good. Yeah. He wrote the psilocybin mushrooms of the world, I believe, in the 90s. Stamets' book, Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World. One study, I mean, there's starting to be so many studies, right? You mentioned like 30 or something on psilocybin. Just something personally, I have a brother he's on the autism spectrum, and they're looking at anxiety, reducing social anxiety in people with autism. And I'm like, I would never have thought like my brother should be microdosing, but like, yeah, maybe he should, So it's challenging, like even my kind of narrower view of psychedelics, which I think as a society we're all going to be doing, or all we are doing right now.
I really believe in the power of psilocybin mushrooms to heal the world. We're sort of in a bad place right now, right? There are two studies in particular that show the power of magic mushrooms to heal some of our social ills. One is the fact that taking psilocybin mushrooms, not in a clinical setting, not as a psilocybin capsule, just any point, it could have even been at a concert you went to, right? Just consuming psilocybin mushrooms at least once in your life reduces your risk of overdosing on opioids. So you're going to make some better choices in life. Somehow it's happening. I can't tell you the mechanism for that, but you have a lower risk. Secondly, we talk about domestic violence in this country and also trauma that women have to endure every day. You know, we talked about the Me Too movement, like things like that. There's a lot of stuff women go through. And if we could reduce domestic violence, we would reduce trauma being handed down from generation to generation. There is a study that shows consuming psilocybin mushrooms reduces domestic violence and reduces violence in general. So again, healing the world through less violence, more love. What more can we ask this mushroom for, right?
Thank you. Awesome. Okay, last question. Rather than take questions, because everybody wants a drink and some food, and you can come ask these folks questions afterwards, I'm going to have each of them give you a question to take away.
Okay, so we didn't actually ask how many people even consumed psilocybin mushrooms here, either at macrodoses or microdoses. But what I want you to do is if you are new to this, learn about this, tell somebody about this, and I want to recommend a website that has great information on psychedelics in general and their benefits, risks, implication for legalizing, etc. It's called drugsoverdinner.org. Host a dinner party. Let's talk about psilocybin. Maybe your mom has done it. You know, like let's normalize the conversation about psilocybin mushrooms in the same way that we did with cannabis, and you might find that more people are open to it than you thought. I mean, we are pretty much in Los Angeles, but not in other cities around the world. Let's start the conversation. Please spark that conversation.
Yes, right on.
Okay, yeah, I've had a lot of thoughts about this, and just
Closer.
purely as a mycologist, thinking about how mycology has a role in the work that you do. Whether that's if you're a grower, if it's a pest that's a problem, like powdery mildew or the mycorrhizae that are helping your plant's roots, or in remediation of the soil. I think we all need to open our minds to all the uses of mycology in our lives, psychedelic, non-psychedelic, and just bring forth this conversation.
Excellent, thank you. Madison?
I'm going to guess a lot of you are in the cannabis space. Ask yourself how you feel about the regulations and the way the cannabis industry looks right now, and then ask yourself if that's what you want for psilocybin.
Great question. Great question. Okay, thank you all so much. Thank the three of you. Just amazing. I want to leave you with one thought. This is my little personal touch here. I just want to read a short poem to you that speaks to my experience with psilocybin. It's by Lal Ded, who was a 14th century Kashmiri saint and poet. I was passionate, filled with longing. I searched far and wide. But the day that the truthful one found me, I was at home.